four, three, two, one, go. So we're live on Syriana Analysis. It's 9 p.m. here, Central European Time. Mark Sleboda, thank you very much for accepting my invitation and being my guest today on Syriana Analysis. You're an international relations and security expert, and with whom I can talk about the issue of the German Leopard delivery and the Panzer, here we call in Germany, better than you. You understand this difficult situation in Ukraine quite well. And today, the German government apparently decided that they want to deliver the tanks to Ukraine. Yesterday, Annalena Baerbock said that they won't block Poland and other allies to send the Leopards, but today it seems this pressure was very big on the government, or let's say on Olaf Scholz. So the United States ramped up its pressure on Germany to send the tanks to Ukraine. Why is this sudden pressure on Germany and the hysteria in the media and activists who give the impression that Ukraine is losing or it's going to lose because of Germany?
Yeah, Kavork, thanks for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be on Syriana Analysis. As to your, the question of why this hysteria and this pressure. First of all, I think it's always important to consider that, always, but particularly in driving this conflict and the narratives in the West around it, the media is a very active political player. It is an actor itself with its own ideological perspective, which is overall extremely hawkish, anti Russia, and pro Kiev regime in Ukraine. There is a reason why we call the media the fourth estate, because it is a power center with interests of its own. And for anyone out there who still believes that the mainstream media or any media is a neutral, objective observer, and that's it. It's the opposite. They are not neutral. They are not objective, and they are not merely an observer. They're an actor, and that's a big player in this. I think it's quite often the media that has been directly putting pressure on politicians in many cases towards pushing for this. And a large part of that is because the Western media, there's a large number of people that really buy into the whole exceptionalism, supremacist ideology that drives Western governments as well. Not just the US anymore, because the Europeans have their own brand of exceptionalism that is just as toxic, and it preaches the moral supremacy of US led Western hegemony. And they full heartedly believe in it. It is not just a matter of money or clicks or hit, ideological. And this particular pressure is, I think, because Germany is very much, however much it may not want to be, at least in the case of Olaf Scholz, it is the political heart of Europe. And what Germany does or doesn't do, simply because of weight of its size, its population, its economy, not necessarily its military, because it doesn't actually have a powerful military at all in any sense of the word. But its particular brand of tanks, the Leopards, in we're talking, all the various models, but I think the Leopard 2 is what is brought up most often, is the most common tank model throughout Europe. And there are some 2,000 of them, all Leopards in Europe. And there is a logistical concern with providing too much of a variety of different types of main battle tanks to the Kiev regime. They already have a ridiculous, absurd amount of logistical issues, having now being completely reliant on Western supplies of everything from weapons to ammunition to fuel, funding, training, everything, you name it. I mean, they are truly a proxy force in every sense of the word. But with such a variety of Western military gear that Kiev regime troops are not trained or very quickly and poorly trained on, they have no parts supply, they have no ability to repair it in the country because all of their military industrial complex has been destroyed and is continuing to be destroyed as they try to raise it up again by Russian long range strikes. They have no ability to repair anything, which means that it has to go all the way across the country
Hmm.
into Poland or Romania to NATO military bases that have been set up there for the purposes of repair and providing a broad variety of main battle tanks, which looks like it's going to happen anyway. But I think the rest of Europe is kind of pushing at least Olaf Scholz on this regard, while or pulling him while within his own party, the war hawk green, quote unquote, Annalena Baerbock, an obvious U.S. quisling in every way, shape, and form, is pushing him from behind. Olaf Scholz's primary political characteristic seems to be political cowardice, and he is quite obviously bowing to the prevailing winds, demanding more escalation, more war, more dead Russians, and consequently more dead Ukrainians in the process.
I'm gonna show to the audience a picture, a poster from the elections that happened last year in Germany. And this is the electoral motto of the Green Party: keine Waffen und Rüstungsgüter in Kriegsgebiete. They don't want to send weapons to the war zones. This was just before the elections, and now they were the ones who pushing the government. They are
I
part of the government, but they were really lobbying against Olaf Scholz in this regard.
Yeah, I love the dove of peace behind a message of war. Is there anything more literally and openly Orwellian than that? I don't think so.
You mentioned the media, and you
Mhm.
said that they are an actor in this regard.
Yes,
But
very
do you
much.
think they are independent from affiliations, and these affiliations aren't probably German? Do they have maybe outside affiliations? Because you also mentioned ideological affiliations, right? For this, so is there any links between the media that is really moving as a one body? An entire industry of German
Yes.
journalists are moving as a one industry against one direction.
Yeah, I think there's always a real synergy between the media and the forces of quote unquote liberal governments in the West. Particularly in the case of Germany, I think there is a higher and always has been a very higher degree of government and media. It's not even so much cooperation. The government penetrated the media in Germany a long time ago and has never stepped back from that kind of pretty much blatant control of the media in Germany, where there is a revolving door between government and media. But in Germany, it tends more towards the government oversight kind, even if that is deemed to be of a benevolent nature.
Now, Germany today, they say they want to deliver their tanks to Ukraine. And the numbers are clear according to the media. Germany can deliver 29 Leopard 2 tanks in April or May of this year, and 22 more by the end of 2023 or early 2024. I mean, militarily speaking, can 50 tanks, like around 50 tanks, make a difference on the battlefield in Ukraine? How long do Ukrainian soldiers need to train to be ready? And how would these tanks be repaired if they were damaged?
Okay. So, first of all, I mean, it is important to keep in mind that in terms of their own military, Germany is a military midget, right? They have a grand total of 277 tanks in their active duty military. And regular government reports cite that because of the poor funding and maintenance of their military, less than half of those are actually operable at any given time. But of course, it won't just be 50 tanks because, like I said, the majority of Europe fields Leopards, and there have already been pledges of them being sent from multiple countries, actually in part of pressuring Germany to go ahead. Poland has said they're going to send 14. Denmark, I believe, has already made pledges, and you can certainly bet that the Baltics and many other countries are going to be sending them as well. The United Kingdom has already pledged 14 of its own Challenger tanks, right? And France has already sent some light AMX 10 RC tanks. Those aren't really properly considered tanks. They're somewhere between an infantry fighting vehicle and a
Hmm.
tank. But I'm very sure that they will be sending a number of Leclercs as well. And we've heard just in recent hours that that coming from the U.S. government, anonymous sources cite that Biden has made the decision to send Abrams as well.
Hmm.
And obviously, this was part of a agreement between the two of them. Now, because of military realities, these tanks are extremely unsuitable to give to Kiev for training reasons, for logistical reasons, for battlefield reasons. This is mostly a political decision, not a military one. U.S.
Hmm.
military was very much against sending, certainly the Abrams, but I think they realized the futility of sending tanks. It won't be just 50, right? I expect that all total, right, between European, UK, and American Abrams, the first pledged tranche of tanks will probably number around 200.
Oh wow.
That will be the total, but that will just be the first tranche, of course. There will be more to follow. So, and I think we can expect that number eventually to range, somewhere around 500 or 600 tanks eventually, right? Say within the next year.
But that can make a change on the ground. We are
It
talking
can
about.
it will make an effect on the ground. Will it change the outcome of the war? No.
Hmm.
How do you know how many tanks that the Kiev regime started this war with?
No.
2,500 tanks.
Hmm.
Right? And since then, that was their first army, 2,500 tanks. They had the second largest army in Europe after Russia, if you consider Russia part of Europe. If not, they had the biggest army in Europe.
Hmm.
Most of those tanks are destroyed now. And since then, they received another at least 500 tanks from Europe, right? That was the old Soviet legacy weapons of the former East Bloc countries. Poland, Romania, Czech, Slovakia, Croatia, even some of them dragged from as far away as Morocco. They refurbished and sent them into Ukraine, right? Starting early in about April of last year. And in total, they've added at least another 500 tanks to the Kiev regime's arsenal, which are also largely now destroyed. They were destroyed in the so called successful counteroffensives in Kherson and Kharkov, where they charged across open steppe in the face of superior artillery and rocket systems and air dominance, and were decimated in these wave attacks on Russian lines. And Russians, they simply, there's two different wars being fought here, two very different military styles. Russia is fighting a classic and cold-blooded war of attrition, artillery heavy war of attrition, where they are not primarily concerned, except I would say in the Donbass area, with taking and holding territory. Their priority is on demilitarizing, i.e., destroying the Kiev regime's military. And because the Kiev regime is simply a proxy for NATO, ever increasingly, what they are actually doing is demilitarizing NATO directly at this point. Those tanks were largely wasted. Russia preserved their forces. They simply tactically withdrew. They adopted, tactics similar to the Mongolian horse archer, where they just refused to engage. when they saw themselves in a tactically disadvantageous position, facing they had superior fires, but they faced superior manpower. They just withdrew and kept doing Parthian shots on the way. And so the victor, where Russia withdrew, not having lost any real battles, what inflicted far higher casualties on the Kiev regime forces. That is why there is the urgent need, the sudden change from Kiev is winning to Kiev is winning and we need to send all these tanks, because there is a realization that all of their military, their first two armies essentially, have been, if not completely destroyed, then degraded to such a point where they're not capable of any type of offensive and very little defensive capacity. And we see all across Donetsk right now, the Kiev regime's defensive lines are being breached everywhere, right? Russia's on the offensive all across the Donetsk region, centered in Bakhmut, but not just in Bakhmut, to the north, the south of it, and now into Zaporozhye as well. So there is a screaming urgency to deliver, more military capacity. And along with those, let's say 200 tanks are pledged. They are sending hundreds of infantry fighting vehicles, including Bradleys and Strykers, and they're sending over 1,000 armored personnel carriers, and other military equipment as well. But it's not going to win the conflict for them. Now, as to your question is how much training to use, say, an Abrams properly. When they gave them to Iraq had a 5-year training program.
Wow.
Saudi Arabia had a 7-year training program. And yet, we saw, these weapons are no wonder weapons, right? Russia has 12,000 tanks.
Oh, wow.
12,000 tanks, right? And hundreds of them are more modernized T-80s, and hundreds, some 600 or more T-90s, which are in every way equal to the most modernized Leopards and the Abrams, if not superior, at least in some regards, with the particulars of the geography of this battlefield, which they're designed for. Which the Abrams, it's an extremely heavy tank driven by a turbine engine. It requires constant maintenance, and it requires a lot of training, because it is a type of tank with an extremely complicated engine and turret, where if you simply operate it wrongly, you can break it and kill people in the tank as well. It is a very complicated weapon. It takes a long time to train to use properly. I suspect that quite eventually we will see NATO personnel, Polish, probably, maybe some Americans, Romanians,
former Marines.
Yes, putting on Ukrainian hats, being on sabbatical from active duty military service and operating these vehicles, because the Kiev regime will not be able to get enough people trained properly. There's a lot of differences between Western main battle tanks and the type of post-Soviet tanks that Ukraine has been using. For one, they require a larger crew because they don't have auto loaders. They actually need a loader in the tank crew. And that big change in tank crew composition and dynamics is actually very big when you're training for a tank. There are other differences as well. They all also require, like the Challenger requires completely different shells from either the Leopard or the Abrams, right? So think of all these logistical problems. The Kiev doesn't have anyone trained to maintain these vehicles as well. And the training to maintain these powerful but extremely delicate and fragile tanks like the Abrams that needs constant maintenance just to work properly. And then there's the question of fuel consideration. They're all heavy and they're gas guzzlers. The Abrams, do you know how much mileage your car get? Do you have a car?
Yes.
Yes. How many miles to the gallon does your car get?
Oh, I'm not an expert on that. You tell me.
Okay. But usually, you talk about cars getting 20 or more miles to a gallon, right?
Gallon.
Right.
Yeah.
The Abrams gets 1 mile to 6 gallons
Oh,
of
wow.
fuel, right? And you're talking about a country that, first of all, is completely reliant for the West on fuel, and now has to use fuel for generators to power electricity for a good portion of their country, on
Hmm.
top of their other military. This is why U.S. military leaders did not want to supply the Abrams. Also, I've seen plenty of videos. The Abrams does not do well in snow or mud. I hate to tell you, it does much better on the sand in third world countries in the Islamic world, but not so much in the mud and snow that characterized the Ukrainian battlefield. And we've seen that they're no wonder weapons, because
Yeah.
we've seen plenty of videos and reporting in Western media of Leopards being destroyed by Kurds and ISIS. Leopard 2s, modernized Leopard 2, field by Turkey in Syria, were destroyed by both ISIS and Kurdish forces, and there was a big embarrassment about that. And Abrams have been fielded by Saudi Arabia, the most modern type, have been destroyed by Houthi rebels fielding 1970s Soviet anti-tank guided missiles, right? The oldest, I mean, if 1970s Soviet weapons did this to an Abram, let's not make the pretense that modern military Russian equipment won't destroy these tanks just as quickly as it destroyed the 2,500 tanks and then 500 more tanks that the Kiev regime started and has received through this conflict to begin. So no matter how many tanks the West sends, let's say 50, let's say 200, let's say 500, let's say 1,000 within a couple years, which I think is not. I think that's already going into ridiculous. They will not be enough to win this war. They will escalate it, and we've already heard from Russian Duma members, Alexei Gerilov, who is also a formal general, by the way. He's a State Duma member. He has called just recently that before the most recent announcement, that if Western main battle tanks are sent to the Ukrainian battlefield, then Russia will have to begin a real general mobilization, not just a partial mobilization of reservists.
Hmm.
And they will have to declare a wartime economy, and they will recognize that NATO has declared war on them, and they are now in a state of direct war with NATO. Russia will escalate in response to this. And I know a lot of Western people don't believe this. They haven't been up to date on how the inability of the Western military industrial complex to supply the type of materials that are needed for this war, particularly like unsexy items like 155 millimeter artillery shells and the like. But if you see that Forbes has been talking about this, the Wall Street Journal has been talking about this. There's a huge shortage of artillery shells in what everyone agrees is an artillery war. And tanks are as vulnerable to heavy artillery shells as everything else. Um,
Mark, if I'm
at
not
the end of the
mistaken,
day, Russia has conventional military escalation superiority here and now in this type of land centric war of attrition in their own backyard over NATO.
mhm.
And people don't believe that, but it's true.
Mark, I'm showing the audience these destroyed tanks, and they are from southern Idlib.
Yes.
And this was from 2018 when the Turkey used these Leopard tanks against the Syrian army, and the Russian forces annihilated a big convoy of Leopards, and some of them were even hit with drones.
Yes.
So let's take this scenario into consideration. Ukraine started this war with Russia for over 2,500 tanks. They have a shortage of tanks because they were annihilated, and now they're getting these more modern, let's say, or Western tanks. So if these tanks were also destroyed and they were documented, because it's an era of digital warfare as well, and these tanks were humiliated, don't you think this will be a nightmare scenario for the Americans and for the Germans
Absolutely.
for their market value in
Ab-
in marketing these weapons.
Absolutely it will, which was one of the big reasons why they didn't want to send them. But the prevailing, I said, politics has made a decision over military common sense in this point. Not only for the marketing side of the military industrial complex, but for how useful these tanks will actually be for the Kiev regime troops for logistical and training and other reasons on the battlefield. But the reason why Russia will consider this such an escalation, like I said, these tanks will kill more Russians. They'll also kill more Ukrainians. I mean, remember that there are tens of thousands of Ukrainians fighting on the Russian side against the regime. They've been fighting the regime for the last 8 years since it seized power. But civilians will die as well in Ukrainian military. But these tanks will not win the war. And we've already seen a far higher number of tanks be destroyed. Even if you make the questionable argument that each Western main battle tank is worth two of the type of modernized, refurbished Soviet legacy tanks they were using, which because of logistical reasons is not necessarily true. But even if so, you see where the numbers that have already been destroyed, quite obviously, or Kiev regime wouldn't be calling for these Western main battle tanks. And like I said, the Soviet legacy arsenals of NATO from the East Bloc weapons they inherited have also been destroyed as well. So the question is then, what is the next escalation step after main battle tanks, right? Because this won't win the war. Where do we go in 2 months from here? How does the West escalate then? Because they almost assuredly will, because they've made statements, they consider US-led Western hegemony to be facing an existential crisis over this conflict. So they will escalate. What is the next escalation step? Long-range missiles capable of hitting targets within Russia and fighter aircraft, right? That's where you go next.
And
right?
that's when Russia would consider this an act of war from the NATO
They
side.
they might already with the tanks, but if they don't, they certainly will with the escalation beyond this. And then you have to say, well, how does Russia escalate to that in reply? Now, NATO is still playing the proxy game where they say they're not at war with Russia. They're just providing weapons to the Kiev regime, weapons and training and intelligence and funding and every ammunition and fuel and everything right there. But it's the Kiev regime, it's Ukrainian forced conscripts that are pushing the buttons and doing the fighting and dying. But what if Russia decides, well, if they're going to play this game and give long-range missiles to Kiev regime forces to strike within Russia in Crimea, and in Belgorod, across from Kharkov and elsewhere. What if Russia gives long-range missile capacity to the militias from Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye that are fighting on the Russian side, allowing them to make long-range strikes against NATO military bases in Poland and Romania that are where these weapons are assembled and transferred to the Kiev regime?
Yeah.
Think where that takes us from there.
I don't want to imagine that, to be honest.
Yes.
I don't want to imagine that.
This is the steps we are taking on the spiral down, and we're not slowing down. We're not hesitating. We are going ever faster down the escalation spiral.
But what are the sentiments now in Russia? Like on a popular level, do they consider that they are in a war now against NATO?
Oh yes,
Or,
yes. The popular sentiment is the majority of the population, however much the West would like to believe otherwise, they know what has been happening in Ukraine for the last 8 years. Remember, there are some 5 million at least Ukrainians living in Russia, right? In the aggressor state, right? What state has more refugees? Well, there were 5 million, there were some 3 million living before this all started. And then since the conflict, the UN has reported that the country with the largest number of Ukrainian refugees is actually Russia.
Russia, huh?
Yeah, there's some 5 million Ukrainians, right? And everyone, particularly in Western Russia, has family in Eastern Ukraine, right? I mean, there's family across both sides of the border. So I'm sorry, but the Russian public knows far more about what is happening and has really been happening in Ukraine for not just the last year, but the last 9 years now. They are fully aware of it, and the vast majority of the Russian people, not saying that everyone does, but some 70, high 70s, up into the 80s approve of what is going on. And the biggest fear that a lot of people have is that it is the government that will not have the political will to see this through to the end. In many ways, the people fear another false diplomatic settlement, another Minsk III that will be used to deceive. They're saying that if we've gone this far, then we need to go further to see this through to the end. And the nostalgia for World War II, right, for that sentiment of a mobilized nation, particularly now with German main battle tanks being sent to a regime in Ukraine with state armed and funded neo-Nazi battalions like Azov, like C-14, like Carpathia Sich. And I don't care how they try to whitewash and apologize for them now. They are Banderite fascist neo-Nazi forces. The commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian military, Valery Zaluzhny himself, is an open Banderite. The Kiev regime Duma, right, or Rada, sorry, the Rada, celebrating the national holiday of Bandera's birthday on January 1st, just tweeted out a selfie that Zelensky shot of himself, right, smiling smugly, but right in front of a photo of the Nazi collaborator and Holocaust perpetrator Stepan Bandera. Right. And this is not the first time. He's done this on multiple occasions. He's got statues of Bandera and Shukovich in his office to show off. Right. That is this regime. Russians see this, right? They see this in their media, things often that Western audience doesn't see. They see that the Kiev regime forces are putting the Iron Cross that was used on the tank corps of the Nazi military already being put by Kiev regime forces on their own tanks. They will certainly do it when they receive Leopards as well. And that is something that will punch home to every Russian family, and no small number of families in East Ukraine who do not support the regime and never have as well. So this is very much becoming a replay of World War II.
This is the commander of chief, right, of the
Yes,
Ukrainian forces.
that is Valery Zaluzhny. That is the four-star general, the commander-in-chief, who is heralded in Western media on the cover of Time and newspaper headlines as a hero.
Mm-hmm. And here is him taking a selfie in front of a portrait of Bandera. And funny enough, Poland, which is very enthusiastic of sending more weapons to Ukraine, they condemn Ukraine's commemoration of wartime nationalist leader Bandera.
This is hilarious, of course. And the only thing that explains it is quite simple, that however much the Poles may have a memory of the massacres, the genocide carried out in Ukraine by West Ukraine, by Bandera's forces, not just against Poles, against Jews, against leftists, against East Ukrainians, is because they hate Russians even more. Their hatred of Russians is the thing that unites them together.
Wow.
And on that picture of Bandera that you showed, the quote that was put up there, that by the official Twitter account of the Kiev regime's parliament, the Rada, is that the quote by Bandera is, paraphrasing here, the true destiny, the true purpose
Hmm.
of Ukrainian nationalism is the destruction of the Russian Empire,
Hmm.
and then was added, and our commander in chief knows full well this pledge by Bandera.
Wow. The thing is, they're not even trying to hide
No,
it. That's the
no, they're
problem.
not. They're not.
And this is what
The
I
Western media is, but the Ukrainians, the Kiev regime,
this is
is not.
exactly what I repeat almost every day nowadays. The mainstream media journals, they have lots of work on their hands to hide all these pictures coming from
They do.
Ukraine, and
And
like they try to hide all these pictures coming from
here's
Syria. They say like those want democracy, human rights, and the
it's
people demonstrating or carrying arms against the government in Syria. They say democracy is equal to apostasy.
yes.
Music is forbidden.
I remember very well. I remember very well. And you know, whether you're talking Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or all the forces, the 31 flavors of jihad that now make up Turkey's new Syrian army,
Mhm.
yeah, they were, and it's the same thing here. And you know, all the pictures that the Western media have, all these photo shoots they've done with Ukrainian forces, 9 times out of 10, you can very successfully play the game of find the Nazi in the picture, because almost guaranteed you're going to find at least one Kiev regime troop in that picture with a black sun, or with an Azov wolf's angle, or some other type of fascist LARPing symbology. And you've seen it on pictures from CNN to NBC to the New York Times to the BBC. There was I'll never forget, there was a picture that the BBC took, and this is still online, you can find it. They took of a Kiev regime intelligence service, the SBU,
Mhm.
in Kiev. They took a picture of him. He was wearing a jacket, a branded SBU jacket, like the FBI in the US wears those FBI
Mhm.
jackets, right? So everyone knows who they are
Mhm.
on a scene when they want to be identified. And beneath the SBU of the Kiev regime's intelligence service, there was a picture of the Galician SS division from World War II.
Mhm.
It was a patch that was obviously just supplied with the jacket, right? These were the Nazi collaborators in World War II. And the BBC just took that picture and they put it on one of their articles with their whitewashing, pro Kiev regime propaganda. And I don't know if they didn't realize it or they didn't care and they don't care, but there was no comment, of course, on that at all.
Hmm. I am trying to find this photo. I couldn't now, but I will definitely find it and post
I will
it
definitely,
on
I will send it to you.
Syriana
Yes.
analysis. In short, Mark, I don't want to take a lot
Yep.
from your time. It's pretty obvious that Russia will launch a fresh and massive offensive in the spring,
Yes.
in the next few weeks. What are the main
Yes.
goals of this operation compared to the beginning of the military
Yeah.
operation in February 2022?
Okay, so I mean, this is completely different. A lot of people have a very bad mischaracterization of how Russia started this conflict out. And I'm on the record as saying that the intervention would happen as far back as last November,
Mhm.
right? And I'm also on the record of criticizing it as soon as it began for being naive, because this was launched, and there's a reason why Russia used the term special military operation that
Mhm.
is beyond just, the US never calls its wars, they're always interventions, right? But it's beyond that, because there really was a military limit to this operation. Russia has 1 million strong active duty military, but they only sent 150,000 troops into Ukraine. And that has not changed the whole course of the year up until October, when Russia began their own their call up of reservists, their mobilization. So
Hmm.
those numbers after receiving their training are only starting now. So only 150,000, and that was buttressed by about 50,000 East Ukrainians, or former East Ukrainians, from the Donbass. So, and that was actually smaller than the Kiev regime's active duty military that started this conflict, was 250,000. The purpose of the SMO and their targeting was extremely limited. Like, there was no infrastructure targeting whatsoever. You know, the US, as soon as it begins a conflict, immediately takes out the electrical supply, whether that is in Serbia or in Iraq or any of the wars that they've fought in the modern era. Russia didn't do that to begin this conflict because they hoped to make a show of force and push the Kiev regime to the political settlement that they were denying, right? Meaning an implementation of the Minsk Accords that everyone had supposedly agreed to, but we now know from Merkel and Macron and Poroshenko, they never intended to fulfill, despite being solidified in a UN Security Council resolution. They were simply meant to buy time for NATO to build up a powerful proxy force in Ukraine. And that self-limited nature has started to change only late in the fall, right? And Russia began its mobilization, and it began its infrastructure destruction campaign, primarily intended to inhibit the Kiev regime's logistical capabilities through electric-powered trains. But this is a much bigger force, right? Russia and Western analysts, you know, the propaganda outfit that is the Institute for the Study of War, the Nuland Kagan outfit, they have admitted that Russia is about to begin an offensive with upwards of 500,000 troops, right? That is more than 3 times more than what Russia started and has fought this conflict with so far. And they have pushed hundreds of new tanks into the theater prepared to use. The Kiev regime is always talking about how they've gathered some 700 aircraft to be used. This is going to be the first year. Season 1 was not a real war. It was not a military campaign because Russia had hoped not to fight a real war. And Alexei Arestovich, the Kiev regime's presidential advisor, at least up until last week, has now said as much, right? That this was not intended to kill large numbers of Ukrainians, even in the military, right? It was intended to force a political settlement, and it was viewed as a quote unquote bloodless, hybrid warfare campaign. Now, because of NATO's escalation and complete involvement in the conflict now, this is going to be a real war now. And we don't know exactly where these forces are going to fall and how they will be used, right? Will it be to cut across the Dnieper and stop the flow of arms into East Ukraine? Will it be to envelop the large, 40,000 Ukrainian troops around the Sviatova Kremenaya front? Will it be a push into a real attempt to lay siege to Kiev? We don't know that yet, but it will be two purposes. One, to destroy the Ukrainian military, the third Ukrainian military, because we're now on a third Kiev regime military. And two, it will ultimately be about regime change, because there is no possibility of any diplomatic settlement with the Kiev regime or its Western patrons at this point, after having seen the Minsk Accords be revealed as a ruse, after the complete ripping up of the January 21st agreement back in 2014, after the U.S. has pulled out of the JCPOA with Iran, out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, out of the Open Skies Treaty, out of the Short Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. There is no reliable partner for a diplomatic settlement on the other side. And the Russian government is finally aware of that. So it will take more than another year. It will probably take several more years. But the ultimate goal of this conflict, to secure the security of the people of Donbass and East Ukraine, but also of Russia, can only ultimately be regime change in Kiev. Nothing less than that is acceptable at this point.
Hmm. Wow. I think the repercussions of this war will not be only limited on Ukraine, but also on the
No.
rest of the world, including the country that I come from, Syria,
Yes.
and the country that is my origin from, Armenia. And this is, guys, the picture that I think Mark referred to on the BBC when
Yeah,
a
there you
member
found
of
it.
the SBU with the
Galician, you
SS
got it. You got it.
with an SS logo on his
Right
back.
there,
It's,
BBC
it's
with
there. It's there.
yes.
And they didn't even make an effort to
Nope.
to blur
To
it
no, it's
or
still
take it
out
out.
there. Right? Yep.
Yeah, it's still out there, unfortunately. Mark Sleboda, it was really a pleasure to talk to you. I learned a lot from you. I'm sure the audience, they were really on fire here, talking about all the topics that you were addressing here. Thank you so much for being my guest on Syriana Analysis. His Twitter link, guys, is in the description below. Please go follow him. And also, he has a YouTube channel. I will also put his YouTube channel now in the description below when I finish this live streaming. Please go and follow his work and see what he's saying. You agree, you disagree, that's a different thing. It just broadens your horizon. Maybe you learn something, maybe you learn new things that you weren't aware of because of the media that is manipulating us all over the place. Mark, thank you very much again.
Kavork, thanks for having me. And a little a secret homage here. When I start, my channel is new, right? I just started it up. But when I said it, I took a look at what you were doing, and I said, someday I want to work up to the professional level of quality that Kavork is doing with Syriana analysis. I even
Wow.
made I even made my wife watch some of your
Oh,
videos to show this is what I want my videos to look like eventually.
wow. I really don't know what to say,
Just
really,
saying.
Mark.
Yeah.
It's a long process. I
Mhm.
started from
Yes.
2017 when I watched my first video. It's you
Yeah.
feel shy
Yes.
watching it
Yeah.
because it was not professional, but through time you learn, and we have
Yeah.
to advance because
Yes.
the mainstream media is so
Yes.
powerful, and we have to deliver messages to the people and wake
Yeah.
up lots of people, open eyes, because we can make change, and this is why we are being fought against, we are being censored and being deplatformed. So this is a long term intellectual also warfare, in my opinion, and we
Yes, it
have
is.
to resist here and try to collect as much as people on the
And
side of the truth.
it's not just you and it's not just me. It's everyone out there watching this as well. We really are all in this together because you are the targets of the type of information warfare that is being waged. So you are very much a participant in this info war conflict as well. Thanks
Yes, thanks you so
for
much,
watching
Mark.
us.
Thank you, guys. And remember, guys, before I close, even if you're not interested in politics, politics is interested in you. So be active, don't be passive, and try to make a change. And see you tomorrow again at 8 or 9 Central European Time PM. Ciao.